The presidency of James Madison, known as the father of the Constitution, is often overshadowed by his towering contemporaries. Madison will face unprecedented challenges as the fourth president of the United States. His tenure is marked by political intrigue, war, and a fight for national survival. In today's episode, we will look at the highs and lows of Madison's administration, from the controversial War of 1812, which many dubbed the Second American Revolution, to the domestic battles over the rechartering of the National Bank of the United States. We'll also look at Madison's resilience, his strategic mind, and the luck that often saved his administration. Let's get started. Following in the footsteps of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson will not seek a third term and instead will endorse his friend and colleague James Madison. Madison, 57 years old at the time, is going to face a very tough campaign. Jefferson's vice president, George Clinton, will join Madison on the ticket, and both will enter into the fray with a sense of apprehension. The context of this election was dire. Jefferson's embargo on England and France had left the country in economic shambles, and it's so bad in the New England states that there are whispers in the New England states of secession. The Federalists, hoping to capitalize on the widespread dissatisfaction of these economic policies, are going to once again nominate Charles C. Pinckney of South Carolina and Rufus King of New York. The campaign trail was ruthless. Anti-Madison newspapers are going to mock his small stature and slam him for the embargo's disastrous effects. One critic even quipped, "Why is the embargo like sickness? Because it weakens us." More significantly, the Federalists are going to accuse Madison of using the embargo to favor domestic manufacturing over foreign trade. But it wasn't just the Federalists who were going after Madison and the policies of the previous administration, like the Embargo Act. There was dissension in the Democratic-Republican Party. There are some in the Democratic-Republican Party who are going to argue that Madison is sympathetic towards the Federalists, advocating for a strong central government. Jefferson's influence was crucial in quelling this internal division. He used his incredible charm and reputation to convince the party to unite behind Madison, preventing many of the dissidents from defecting to the Federalist Party. To illustrate the divisions that we see in the Democratic-Republican Party, George Clinton, who is the vice presidential nominee on the ticket with Madison, denounced the nomination process within the party and decided to run against him. Despite these challenges, the outcome of the election of 1808 was decisive. When the Electoral College cast its vote on December 7th, there was very little doubt about the result. Madison secured 122 electoral votes to Pinckney's 44. Clinton, running independently, only secured 6, all from his home state. Madison carried 12 states, where Pinckney only carried 5. And all 5 of those states were in New England. It seemed that the outcome of the election proved that the Virginia dynasty was still going strong. During Madison's first term, his popularity swung wildly depending upon the state of affairs with Great Britain. From the outset in 1809, Madison was preoccupied with British aggression on the high seas. And Great Britain was constantly violating American neutrality rights, and anytime that Madison tried to address these issues, it only seemed to amplify his critics' voices. In New England, for example, the perceived pro-French policies and the economic effects of these trade restrictions amplified and escalated the anger in those regions. Meanwhile, calls for action were growing louder in Congress. Lawmakers in the Midwest and the South were eager to confront British-backed Indian attacks in the Ohio River Valley and to expand American territory by kicking the British out of Canada. They also wanted to see the Spanish removed from West Florida. Madison, though reluctant to overstep his constitutional bounds, sends a special message to Congress in June of 1812, laying out the grievances of Britain and putting the decision of war on their shoulders. The debates were intense, and By the end of June, the House of Representatives will decide in favor of war by a vote of 79 to 49. That will then go to the Senate, and by a vote of 19 to 13, the Senate will also vote in favor of war. Thus, the War of 1812 began, a conflict that will define Madison's presidency and test this young nation's resilience. Just 15 days before he sent his war message to Congress, Madison is able to secure his endorsement for a second term. On May 18, 1812, the Democratic-Republican caucus in Congress is going to endorse Madison, though not without controversy. Many of the Democratic-Republican legislators are going to boycott the caucus, refusing to participate in the renomination process. For vice president, they're going to initially select John Langdon of New Hampshire, who declines. They end up settling on Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, a distinguished statesman and a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Gerry is replacing George Clinton, who was Madison's vice president for his first term and Jefferson's vice president for his second term. So he has been vice president for 8 consecutive years, and he has just recently died of a heart attack in April of 1812. However, dissent within the party was far from over. A faction of New York Democratic Republicans who boycotted the caucus are going to rally behind DeWitt Clinton, the nephew of the late Vice President George Clinton. They had hoped to build this broad coalition of anti-war Democratic Republicans, Northerners who were tired of the Virginia Dynasty, and disillusioned New Englanders. They're also going to be able to pull in some Federalists who, despite their significant ideological differences, are ready for a change. Together, they will nominate Clinton for president and Jared Ingersoll for vice president. Clintonians, as they came to be known, are going to tailor their message to appeal to different factions. They promised one thing to war hawks and yet another to peace advocates and yet another to Federalists opposed to Madison. This flexible approach alienated people like John Quincy Adams, son of former President John Adams, who not only endorsed Madison, but campaigned for him in Massachusetts. But despite this formidable opposition, Madison is once again going to be triumphant, winning 128 electoral votes to Clinton's 89. Madison will carry 11 states, including the crucial southern states, as well as Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Vermont. The Federalists' attempt to unite with the Clintonians backfires and weakens their position, underscoring the challenges of unseating a wartime incumbent president. Madison's victory also, at least in the mind of Madison and his administration, reaffirmed that the country approved of his leadership in the war that many will dub as the Second American Revolution. Throughout Madison's presidency, foreign affairs overshadowed domestic issues, especially while the country was at war. In his public addresses, Madison consistently emphasized the importance of neutrality and the need for respect from European powers. His first inaugural address highlighted a commitment to neutrality, especially in the ongoing conflict between France and Britain. But by the time of his second inauguration on March 13, 1813, Madison was completely immersed in war. And he is going to condemn the actions of the British, especially their support of frontier attacks on American settlers. Among the domestic issues that managed to stand out during the war was the debate on whether or not to re-up the charter for the National Bank of the United States. The bank's charter was set to expire in 1812, and efforts to renew this charter were going to face very stiff opposition. You had old Republicans who opposed this national bank because they felt like it was unconstitutional. They felt like it was a defender of Hamiltonian influence. But you also had anti-British Democratic Republicans who were very troubled by the significant and substantial amount of British holdings in the national bank. Additionally, you had state banking interests who were concerned about having this national bank in control of the nation's finances. the recharter of the National Bank will ultimately fail. And this is going to leave the United States in a war with Britain without a stable financial system. It won't be until 1816, with the support of Madison, that we will see the second National Bank of the United States chartered, further adding to the controversy that Madison had Federalist leanings. Another significant piece of legislation that was passed during this era was the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809, which replaced Jefferson's embargo. This act reopened trade with all nations except for England and France, barring their ships from American ports. If either nation lifted its restrictions against American trade, then the president could lift their trade restrictions against that country. When neither country responded, Congress is going to pass Macon's Bill number 2, removing all trade restrictions, but allowing the president to reinstate them if either nation repealed its restrictions and the other did not follow suit. France took the opportunity in August of 1810, prompting Madison to act. However, Great Britain refused to move away from their aggressive stance, insisting on seizing American ships until France fully lifted the trade restrictions on them. This is going to lead to heightened tensions, with Congress making military preparations and imposing a 90-day embargo in April of 1812. Madison's subsequent list of grievances, which we spoke about earlier in the episode against Britain, including the impressment of American sailors and support for Native American attacks, quickly led to the declaration of war on June 18, 1812. Madison and the war hawks viewed this conflict as a second independence, if you will, as a way to drive the British out of Canada, to drive the Spanish out of West Florida, to quell Indian attacks, and to secure maritime independence. The initial American offensive against Canada, however, ended disastrously. By the fall of 1812, American forces had suffered defeats at Detroit and near Niagara Falls, with much of the Northwest Territory falling to the British. The tide turned somewhat in the spring of 1813 with victories like Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry's triumph on Lake Erie and William Henry Harrison's success at the Battle of Thames, where Native American leader Tecumseh was killed. In the spring of 1814, General Andrew Jackson's forces decisively defeated Tecumseh's remaining followers at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend.
Events took a dire turn in late 1814. With Napoleon defeated, the British could now turn their full attention to America. British forces raided American ports and launched an invasion down the Champlain Valley, which was repelled after an American naval victory on Lake Champlain. However, British forces succeeded in moving into Washington, D.C. and burning the White House and other federal buildings in retaliation for the American burning of the Canadian Parliament in York. Their advance was halted in Baltimore, where Fort McHenry withstood the bombardment that inspired Francis Scott Key to write The Star-Spangled Banner.
Despite Madison's struggles throughout the war, victories against Tecumseh and in New Orleans lifted the American spirit and returned Madison to a high point of public support. What's interesting is that in the Battle of New Orleans, we tend to hang our hats as Americans on this battle because, you know, we sometimes talk about this as a turning point. This is where we see the rise of Andrew Jackson. But the reality of the timeline is the Treaty of Ghent, which was the peace treaty to end the war, had already been agreed upon. But word traveled so slowly back then that the men down in New Orleans didn't know that the war was over. But we won. And so when we kind of reflect on the War of 1812 and we look at specific battles like the Battle of New Orleans or the Battle of Thames, these are moments in time where we start to see national pride begin to swell. On the other side of the War of 1812, nationalism, nation building, that is going to ramp up. We're also going to see future presidents emerge from this war. Guys like William Henry Harrison, who fought in the Battle of Thames, and General Andrew Jackson, who was a prominent figure in the Battle of New Orleans. These guys will serve in the White House in years to come. Not all Americans, however, wrap themselves in the flag of patriotism. New England states rarely met their quotas of militiamen, and New England merchants and farmers often freely traded with the enemy. When the British offensive included northern ports, you're going to see many New Englanders begin to question, should we go ahead and secede from the Union? And in an attempt to block the secessionist sentiment, you're going to see a group of more moderate Federalists get together and hold a convention in Hartford, Connecticut. This will become historically known as the Hartford Convention. But at this convention, they're going to propose a series of constitutional amendments to protect sectional rights. The convention's leaders brought their proposals to Washington, D.C. just as news broke of the Battle of New Orleans and the Treaty of Ghent. Now, to the nation, the participants at the Hartford Convention are going to look like traitors. At the bare minimum, they're going to look like unpatriotic troublemakers. So this is going to help bring about the end of the Federalist Party as a political entity. For many historians, Madison is a puzzle. The father of the Constitution, the co-founder of the Democratic Republican Party, the brilliant mind that served as Secretary of State in the Jefferson administration and now fourth President of the United States. But in many historical circles, Madison is not considered to be a great president. And why is that? I think some of it can be chalked up to Madison's personal strengths. Madison was viewed by his contemporaries as the master of the small arena. He was studious, he was keenly political, and a good judge of both men and issues. He could shape constitutions and influence legislation, but oftentimes as president, he was viewed as too cautious to make the big decisions. Moreover, unlike the tall Washington and Jefferson, Madison was shorter than average, even in his day and age. I mean, he was barely over 5 foot, barely weighed over 100 pounds, but John Adams was short too. But John Adams kind of exuded this rock-like character and exuded authority. That was not Madison's style. However, if you get Madison behind closed doors in small arenas, very few men could tell him no. But for his good fortune, such as Andrew Jackson's victory in New Orleans or England's preoccupation with Napoleon, Madison might have lost more than just his good standing in history. I mean, think about it. He was very close to being captured by the British when they ransacked Washington, D.C. And in his wife, Dolly, he found great fortune in a wife who always did everything she could to endear the Madison family to the nation. She always made him look good, reflecting good luck on his part rather than style of leadership or executive ability. Recently, however, historians have begun to pay more attention to Madison, viewing his handling of the war in similar ways that we view Lincoln's handling of the American Civil War. Madison's government marshaled resources, they blocked secessionist attempts in New England, and proved to the British the folly of fighting wars with the Americans. And once and for all, Madison will establish respect for American maritime rights on the high seas, leaving the war with more public support than when he entered office in 1809. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time.